And I'll do a brief flyover of what we covered Wednesday since I forgot to record. But chapter 10 deals with the news media and its influence, a strong influence in America. It is like a political party or an interest group. It's a linkage organization. It began by being partisan, with one newspaper focused on the Federalists and another focused on the Anti-Federalists or the Democratic Republicans. But subscriptions were not very high because it was a more expensive paper and only the elite could afford it. But it just really gave updates on what these political parties were doing. Advances in technology and transportation made newspapers cheaper, and the invention of the telegraph made it possible for news to travel around a lot more quickly. And newspapers started getting financial contributions from people and businesses who wanted to advertise. And so the news went from being partisan to being more informative. The technique of yellow journalism is very sensationalistic reporting. And it's basically designed to increase readership. Excuse me for a second. You guys remember I'm a pastor, so I got a couple emails here from church members that I need to check on. But this was a journalism that Teddy Roosevelt did not like. And eventually it led to stricter standards in how they reported, but more so in radio, remember. There had to be equal time. Newspapers eventually they cut down on the sensationalistic stuff, and they reported news from a main news source like the AP Press, so that all major newspapers had the same articles. The only way they differed mostly was through their editorials by their editors. Usually a paper leaned one direction, but for the most part, their main articles were to be neutral. We began the more modern understanding of the media as gatekeepers. That is, they allow the flow of information into the public. And it's been narrowed down to 4 functions of media today. The last thing we talked about was the signaling function, where they help the public to be aware of something that's happening. Your special reports that you sometimes break in when you're watching a program is a part of that signaling function. The second function of the media is to be a common carrier of information. The basic principle here is it educates the audience that's watching. It presents a story. Hopefully it presents facts. That's the ideal, is that the news is simply to report the facts and let the audience make their decisions. There's a lot of complaining today about your major news sources being biased. Instead of just reporting the facts, they are also giving their opinion and trying to influence people's thinking, which there's some truth to that, certainly. But the media should be a conduit of information to help the people be informed. This is one way that political leaders inform the general public, through the news. One of the presidential strategies for using the news as a common carrier to give information to the public is what's called the Rose Garden strategy. The president's people will plan a meeting with the press outside the White House in this Rose Garden, in which the president can inform the people of an important development or future plans. There's President Bush using it. I think that's Obama there. So this is a strategy that the executive branch uses to inform the public. I believe it was the Rose Garden last week where President Trump presented his Supreme Court nominee, and that's where several people have been traced to having contracted the coronavirus. Now, one thing that our textbook brings out is that even though the president will, or the executive branch, and sometimes you have the legislative branch schedule a press meeting, even though they may schedule it, they really don't control what goes to the American people. Because first of all, if we take Obama here, he would want to present things that would, he would want to present information that would line up with his ideology. But the news organizations will act as a filter, and they're supposed to be nonpartisan. And so they will have newscasters who may comment on what the president says, or a lot of times, if the president shares something, they will have a senator from the opposite party sharing an opposing viewpoint. So even though the president may have called the Rose Garden meeting to make an announcement, all of your news organizations might say, all right, we have Senator so-and-so from Oklahoma, and we would like to get his or her comments on what the president has said. So that's a part of the media having a nonpartisan role in being a common carrier. Another way that the media controls the information is what's called sound bites. Our textbook really gives a good example here. In the 1960 presidential debate between JFK and Richard Nixon, a sound bite in which a president spoke averaged 40 seconds. Now it's barely 10 seconds. So the media and you'll hear a lot of you'll hear politicians complain about this a lot. Oh, you took that comment out of context, and that happens a lot. But that's what media does: is they take the sound bites that they want, and they present it to the American people. So what that does, in essence, is allow partisanship or personal views to slip back in to the media presentation. Another thing that the media does is called framing. And we can just think of a frame, a frame that is constructed to hold a picture. In the same way, the news media will basically set up, they will set up the way they want the information to be presented. So here's an example, and this is a very relevant example since we just had a militia group arrested in Michigan. But imagine here in Oklahoma, the Ku Klux Klan is planning a rally at the state capitol. Here's a couple of scenarios of how different news outlets may frame it. One station does a story on the rally, and they suggest the KKK rally may attract protesters, which might result in violence. Another news channel might interview a police sergeant about how extra security is going to be needed to prevent injuries. Actually, this is the same story, sorry. This is story number one. Let's say a station there in Oklahoma City. They're suggesting that there could be violence. They're interviewing a police sergeant about what have you done for extra security. This reporter is framing it as a public safety issue. Let's say a station out of Tulsa does a story. They are at the state capitol in Oklahoma City. And this story focuses on the KKK's right to assemble in public and to voice their opinions. They interview a law professor from Oklahoma City University who talks about the right of the KKK to assemble under the protection of the Bill of Rights. Looking at these pieces of information, this story is being framed as a freedom of speech issue. The first one is a public safety issue. This one is being presented as a freedom of speech issue. So depending upon what news broadcast you watch, the way they frame it and present it is going to it's going to be something that is available to you to consider. Let's say you are a person who is concerned about public safety, but you watch this television station. Now your tendency is to worry about public safety, and you realize that yes, we do have freedom of speech, but as we've studied already in class from the 4 freedoms in the First Amendment, there's some speech that is not legal. And so while the station is framing it as a freedom of speech issue, your tendency is to think of public safety. And so, but what they've done is they presented another viewpoint. Now, if you're a strong, opinionated person about we've got to keep people safe, people's safety is more important than freedom of speech, then you're going to consider this, but you're probably going to dismiss it out of hand. Here's another example. You guys were probably 6 years ago, probably what, 10 or 11 years old, when this man here, George Martinez, shot and killed Trayvon Martin. Now you might watch one news station and these are the pictures that they use. Notice that Trayvon is smiling. Looks like a good, regular, normal kid. A little darker skinned than George. Even though George is Latino. The darker facial hair can give him a lighter looking complexion. His facial feature is kind of menacing or not nice, mean. Don't know if this is his mugshot, but the orange shirt might suggest that it is. They will say that Trayvon Martin was a child. I think he was 17 or 16. But they'll say Trayvon Martin, a child, was shot and killed. Now look at this other station and how they frame it. This would probably be one of your conservative stations like Fox or The Blaze. Martinez is smiling, got a suit and tie. Suit and tie conveys an upstanding citizen, responsible. The picture of Trayvon here is not smiling, but the furrowed brows to make him look maybe a little angry. A little bit more lighter complected down here. But what they're doing is they're framing their stories hoping to have an influence on public opinion. Now, George was found innocent. It really hurt the case when they couldn't call him a white man anymore because he was Latino. He was a part of a neighborhood watch. Trayvon was not like a 12 or 13-year-old child. He was 16 or 17. I think he had attacked George. But instead of giving all of those facts at the front, a lot of news organizations will simply show the pictures and say, a white man, George Martinez, shot and killed a black child, and now there's protests for justice. That's framing. Any questions on the framing function, which is a part of the common carrier? The third function is the watchdog function. Basically, the news media has taken upon themselves to expose corrupt political leaders. In some instances, in this function, sometimes the press is called the fourth branch of government, in quotations, because you have your regular three branches and then you have this fourth branch that is going to watch very closely the goings-on of the politicians, their decisions. And this cartoon portrays Trump as not caring for the media and their watchdog role. This particular case was about, did he really give as much money to charities as he said? This would have been early in his presidency. But even before he was elected, you know, things came out about him having hired prostitutes or paying models, cheating on his wife. The video came out of him saying very crude things to the reporter. Those are watchdog functions. This comes from a classically liberal viewpoint. And when we talk about classically liberal, we're talking about in a country that's set up as a democratic republic, the press is free, right? Remember, that's one of the freedoms of the First Amendment. The press is free to report facts and the truth without government interference. When the government tries to control the press, and sometimes when the government does control the press, you get basically a propaganda tool for your leaders. Let's think about North Korea for a moment. North Korea is a communist country with a brutal dictator. And you can be assured there that there is no freedom of the press there. If you are a part of the press, you will report what you are told to report by the government. And if you were to try to expose something scandalous by the dictator or someone in the government, you most likely will disappear. So in classically liberal political thinking, the primary role of the media is to be a watchdog and watch and oversee the state. And if they find any abuses, they are to reveal them. There's also an element of this belief that the media must be anchored in the free market. And so television stations, newspapers, radios, they can raise funds by advertising, and they don't get money from the state, and they can get donations, and so they raise money in a free market, and that's so important in what they report. Now, for the last almost 50 years, the media as a watchdog has stood on the foundation of the Watergate scandal and the Watergate reporting of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein in the early 1970s. These two men right here, Woodward and Bernstein, wrote several articles for the Washington Post during the after the Watergate break-in. The Democratic National Party headquarters was in the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., and it was broken into, and the men were caught, and they were eventually linked to very high officials in the Republican Party. These guys did investigative reporting. They even had a anonymous source called Deep Throat who gave them information. And eventually, after writing all those articles, they wrote a book, All the President's Men, and they broke the Watergate scandal wide open. And eventually, Nixon resigned before he could be impeached, because he was on his way to being impeached, but also removed. President Trump, President Clinton, and then President Andrew Johnson are the only 3 presidents to ever be impeached, but they were not removed. There is no doubt that Nixon would have been impeached and then he would have been removed. So this is the book that came out. It was made into a very popular movie 1 year later. But as I said, this is the kind of the foundation for modern media watchdog function. I don't know if you guys pay attention to the news, but Bob Woodward is still writing books. And he just came out with one a few weeks ago about Trump that was called Rage. A lot of times you'll see Carl Bernstein as a political commentator on CNN. And so we've seen several things in the last few years where the media is exercising their watchdog role. This is Canadian President Justin Trudeau. And just last year, an old picture of him in blackface came out, which is a no-no today. 2 years ago, Trump's second Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh, he went through a meat grinder of a trial. I mean, they pulled out old yearbooks from his high school years, and they looked very, very carefully. This is a senior picture, and you know, at the time, seniors got to list all of their activities, and then they got to put in things that basically described who they were. And so some of these things here were scrutinized very closely by the Democrats. The Wendy Whitney fan club. Hey, Judge, have you boofed yet? Beach Week Ralph Club. A lot of speculation that those were keg parties where they got sick. If you got sick to the point where you threw up, it was called Ralphing. Ralphing in the toilet. Some of these other things here got really scrutinized, but that was watchdog function of the media. And it kind of leaked over into the Democratic Party in the trials of Brett Kavanaugh. And if you watch some of the ads now for Trump, and well, one of the things about Trump, not an ad, but you know, now they've said they've found out that he only paid $750 in taxes a few years ago. That's a part of the watchdog function. They're trying to find things that show corruption. And then the fourth function of the media is back again to what it originally was, and that is, it is partisan. It becomes a channel for political viewpoints. But there are different levels according to the kind of media it is. This is pointed out in your textbook. Now this here shows the major TV stations. And you can see here that Fox is the only one that leans conservative. And then all these other 5 lean this way. And I really think CNN, this graph might be a few years old. CNN should be probably over here on the side of the 3 major networks from the 1950s and 60s and 70s. This chart shows not just television stations, but radio stations, internet websites that present news. And so this here being the middle, Fox is conservative leaning. They say the New York Post, a newspaper, is conservative leaning, the Washington Times. Then over here, you've got other outlets of news, primarily on the internet, that are even farther right than Fox News. Infowars.com, the Drudge Report, the Rush Limbaugh program, they all lean heavily to the right. And then to the left of Fox and going all the way to the extreme left are all of these groups. And they've kind of got CNN where it needs to be. ABC, CBS are all over here. I'm not seeing NBC. A website that I like to use, Snopes.com, they have actually leaning somewhat to the left. But this is that 4th function of the media. They do, some of these were set up explicitly to present one viewpoint. MSNBC was set up to be very liberal. Fox was set up to be conservative. So this is that partisan function coming in. This is the inside 5 of this graph here. Now, this is how the media has transformed since the early 1980s. Just imagine a young and very boyishly handsome Instructor Bings watching news one night in 1984, and he has 3 choices. And growing up in the Oklahoma City area, Channel 4 would have been NBC, Channel 5 would have been ABC, and Channel 9 would have been CBS. These were the main 3 outlets for news. Now, if I wanted to, I could have watched PBS, Public Broadcasting System, which is basically public television. They have a news hour, but you know, it's not like the big 3. Now, it's true that I could have bought a New York Times or a Washington Post, but young, boyishly handsome Instructor Bings only reads the Daily Oklahoman, and mostly for the sports page and the comics. I wasn't the major government and history intellectual that you see today. But those were available. But I was content with the good old Daily Oklahoman. Well, starting in the late 80s, you had Ted Turner, who owns the Atlanta Braves, started Turner Broadcasting and started CNN. And then in the early 90s, you had Fox News come aboard. And then you've had all these outlets, except the newspapers and some of the magazines, added. And so now we have multiple sources to get our information from. And instead of having all of these outlets, which in theory, you might think, oh, I've got so many ways to get all the facts. And so does my neighbor, and so does my teacher, and so does my pen pal across the nation, that we're all going to get the facts and we're all going to be united and on the same page. But that's not what happened. With all of these extra news outlets, we've become more fragmented. Because, well, Fox News isn't conservative enough for me, so I'm going to go and I'm going to get Newsmax.com and the Drudge Report, and I'm going to watch The Blaze because it's more ultra right. And you might say CNN, they're no longer liberal enough, so I'm going to watch MSNBC, and I'm going to subscribe to the Washington News. And I'm going to find other extremely left news organizations. So it's made us more fragmented, and we've become truly the divided states of America. Now, I'm just going to say this very quickly so we don't have to stay in chapter 10 when we come back on Monday. But the textbook points this out, so make sure you read it. Your traditional media, like the big three and some of the newspapers, and let's include CNN and Fox News, are mostly neutral. Mostly. Your talk shows like the Rush Limbaugh show, the Don Lemon show on CNN. No, not Don Lemon, sorry. It's kind of changed since our textbook put this in there, but most of your talk shows were mostly conservative. Limbaugh, Hannity, Fox News. But now we're seeing more of the liberal stations have more talk shows. And then the internet leans more to the liberal side. Although we're seeing more conservative YouTubers and bloggers crop up. So make sure you read that information in chapter 10. We are now ready to move on to chapter 11 when we come back on Columbus Day. Any questions from you outstanding students? Have a great weekend. And we remember your initial reply to the vice presidential debate is due tomorrow night. So if you didn't get to watch that riveting TV, you need to do that before you reply, because Instructor Bings watched it and he knows if you'll be telling the truth. I'll be like a watchdog professor. I want you all to mention the insect in your post, and that way I'll know you did watch it. Mention the famous insect from the vice presidential debate. All right, any questions one more time? I forgot our Ben Franklin Friday quote, so I'll try to get back on my game next week. All right, have a great weekend. We'll see you Monday. I'll stay on if there's any private questions.
Thank you.
See ya.
Yep.
Well,
See you later. Any of you three have a question? You can chat or ask away if you don't care if the others hear you. I'm going to send a chat to you, Jackson. Dustin and Raylan, do you have anything?